Welcome to the Atheist in Recovery podcast, where we talk about finding hope in recovery. And now your host, Dr. Adina Silvestri.
Hello, boys and girls, ladies and germs, and welcome to episode 17 of the Atheists in Recovery podcast. And today we are talking all about sex. I wanted to have Dr. Nazanin Moali on the show probably since I started the podcast. I knew she'd be a great resource, and I'm a big fan of her podcast as well. So today we talk all about sex and how it's different when you're sober. That may occur to you that it's different, but it doesn't have to be. And so we talk about how you can have a healthy sex life while in recovery, and the things that you missed about taking drugs or being high while having sex. You can also not have the drugs and the alcohol, but you can also find a path to great sex. And Dr. Moali gives us some tips on how we can do that. And then we kind of just have a general conversation about sex and sexual dysfunctions and male performance and what all of that looks like and how you can find support. Because as Dr. Moali says, if you're over the age of 16, you've probably had some sexual performance issues. And she does a great job of normalizing it. So I know you can tell I'm a big fan. Let's get on to our guest here. Dr. Nazanin Moali is a licensed clinical psychologist and an expert in the psychology of food, sex, and drugs. Her private practice is located in the South Bay area of Los Angeles, and she specializes in working with couples and individuals struggling with issues of sex and intimacy. Dr. Moali hosts a weekly podcast called Sexology, introducing the most intriguing findings in the psychology of sex and intimacy. Okay, here we go. Dr. Nazanin Moali, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited about this conversation.
Me as well. So I thought we would start with going back to the very beginning and talking about your spiritual background from childhood.
Very interesting conversation and topic because it's been my relationship with spirituality has been very complicated. I was born and grew up in Iran right after Islamic revolution. And because of all the changes in the environment, and we used to have a secular government and then turned religious, it caused my family and especially my mom to have lots of issues with psychological adjustment, with changes in women's role, and she struggled emotionally a lot. And being a child, I saw it as a way that religion was playing a role in it. I thought, okay, because she wasn't necessarily connecting with this new regime and the religious kind of like oppression, that's why she's oppressed. So anyhow, but because of that, I felt I always had a complicated relationship with religion. I consider at time being spiritual, but not religious at all. Obviously, as a therapist, I value my clients' belief and I help them to use it as a coping mechanism if it's appropriate for them. But I myself consider myself not religious at all.
Yeah. So that's so interesting. So you thought that, growing up, you thought that religion played a huge part in your mom's emotional discomfort or depression. What were the conversations like, especially during that that Islamic revolution. Were there conversations about religion? How did you? Yeah, what was that like?
Very interesting because there was, and it was right around the Iran-Iraq war, and there was just like a feeling of terror because my mom used to be a head of her cheerleading in a school, lots of like a very progressive woman, and now like she didn't know what to tell me because I was going like in schools, the hijab was mandatory. All the information I was getting, like, make sure you're not telling anyone we're drinking alcohol at home, make sure people, they don't know we do this and that. So that was very painful because it created this duality for me that I was feeling, okay, so I have to hide part of our lives. And there was not necessarily a conversation about the positive side of religion because of, again, whenever I was hearing about religious information, it was in the light of make sure you're not telling people the things we do at home, which is very ironic and interesting.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Yeah, that is very interesting. How do you think that sort of shaped the way religion or lack thereof affected you in the choices that you made professionally?
Well, it caused some complex at times because I know part of the even psychological teaching, depending on the school of thoughts, are kind of rooted in religion. So that caused me to think more deeply about the meaning of life. What would I want my legacy to be? Because at times when people have religious upbringing, they think, okay, I'm doing good, therefore I'm going because I want to go to heaven. So it's easier. At times I find it, especially for kids and teens and young adults, it might be easier because your path is kind of defined for you. But when you are not necessarily following a religion, that can be confusing. But I'm glad about the kind of impact it had on me because instead of me following a kind of doctrine that was predefined and it wasn't, perhaps I know there was possibly aspect of it that wouldn't work for me, I was kind of forced to think about what is it really important for me, what are some of the values that are important for me as a person, and what can I do to create a life based on those.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. I think that for young people, religion can be incredibly important. And for the people that I see in my practice, religion or spirituality it can be a place to where they, even if they are atheist, they might still pray to God, because there's that, let me give this up to you, let me have this, let me give you this hurt and this pain and for you to hold on to it. Because I just can't think about it anymore. Or I don't know what to do anymore. So, okay. I thought we could switch gears and talk a little bit about your work with sex addiction.
So part of my practice, I do sex therapy and working with people who are struggling with sexual compulsivity, and I have a background in addiction. So tell me, what would be a helpful direction for us to go?
Okay. So I would like us to talk about maybe how you got involved in working with people that are struggling with sex addiction, and then we'll talk a little bit about how that relates to your sexual self and what that experience is like sober.
So I tell people, like, my first passion in field of psychology was addiction. The way that I decided to pursue psychology was through the work I did at VA. So I was a biology major undergrad, and as part of the requirement to get into medical school, I started doing this research at the VA hospital in San Diego around addiction. and veterans, and like hearing people's stories, it was so fascinating. And I fell in love with it. I was like, okay, I don't want to go to medical school. I want to be a psychologist. So the field of addiction always been very fascinating for me. So, and I work at different settings. I work at methadone clinics with people who were really struggling and they were in a harm reduction model. I work at a day treatment IOP for PhD for people who were going to going to the full day program to address their substance use and alcohol abuse. What I found that at times when people were stopping their alcohol use, their substance use, like that compulsivity gets transferred to something else. At times it could transfer to food. At times it was sex. And it was fascinating because although they were feeling they were doing the work, they were no longer drinking or using, but they were masturbating 4, 5, 6 hours per day, or they were kind of like changing from kind of like being as like someone who does sexual behavior with their partner to kind of like working with like hiring sex workers, kind of doing lots of different things that was not necessarily congruent with who they were. Again, there's nothing wrong with sex workers, but again, these were people who were doing things that was kind of causing that shame that they wanted to avoid when they decided to become sober and not drinking alcohol or substances. And I felt, okay, this is fantastic and fascinating, and I want to explore this. And that's how I got into world of kind of working people who are struggling with sexual compulsivity.
Mm-hmm. Yes. You have experience in a myriad of different arenas. So let's talk about being in recovery. So what does sex look like, and how is it different when you're sober versus when you're in active addiction?
Very important topic to talk about, and I'm glad we are having this conversation, because sometimes my experience is that people started like using alcohol or substances in a way as a way for them to address their sexual dysfunctions. So perhaps they had some issues around sex and sexuality and intimacy, and that's how they got into drinking. So now that they're no longer drinking or using substances, the primary issue of sexual dysfunction might resurface. The other part of it is at times when people are using substances that cause some sexual dysfunction, and that impacts people's confidence, and that is another way that can kind of cause issue and kind of struggle for people to that they need to address when they are in starting the path to recovery. So again, depending on where people are and what was their relationship with their sexuality when they were using, there are different paths to take. For example, for people who were drinking alcohol, and alcohol was the drug of choice, we know that with kind of sometimes when people drink alcohol, that helps with delaying the ejaculation. People are like kind of have less of a performance issues, but it's a kind of a complicated relationship, because we all heard about when you're drinking too much, then you will not be able to perform at all. So it depends on what was their relationship with substances. It gives us tons of good information about what direction we need to go. For example, at times I work with women who are in recovery from marijuana. And they're telling me that sex was great because they had this heightened sensation when they were high, and now they just don't feel connected to their body, and they just don't want to have sex. So it's important to see what was the substance we're doing for you, and what we can do right now to help you to still have wonderful, healthy sex life, because it's absolutely possible. You just need to to have right tools in your toolbox.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So maybe we should stay on the path of having sexual intimacy issues. And then maybe we could expand from there, because I'm thinking of like, oh, these great questions. Yeah. So if you are having sexual intimacy issues and then you decided to start drinking, or, that's how you dealt with the issues, what happens when you decide to become sober? How does that, where do you go for help, I guess would be the first question.
Well,
Yeah.
that's a challenge that many people have, because that was a temporary solution. And that's no longer, that it sounds like if someone is in recovery, they don't want to go through that path. So it's important to address it. First of all, like as far as like issues like erectile dysfunction, sometimes it's interesting that how inaccurate is the information that people have around that. Every single male that if they are sexually active enough, they're going to have some issues around performance. So no one is like 10 out of 10 all the time. It's everyone. Again, I work with a male in their young 20s and they're healthy. And if you are above age 16, there are going to be times that there are going to be some performance issues, erectile issues. So that can be like something that can be normal. But again, if that was an issue that you had, first of all, it's important to kind of see what are some of the contributing factors. You can kind of look into those factors yourself, or you can get therapy from it. Is it at times it could be hormonal? So you can go to your urologist or gynecologist, get a hormonal panel done and see where is the issue. Is it biological? Is it relational? Because sometimes people undermine the relational component of sex. Many of the men that I work with, they tell me like, "Oh, I couldn't perform with the one night stand I had," and it's common. Sometimes people have issues performing in kind of one night stand relationships, or again, if there's an issue going on with your partner, it's unresolved trauma or it's unresolved interpersonal issues that will impact your performance. So it's important to see where is their issue lies. Is it the medical component of things? So you can address it with your urologist, with your gynecologist, with your physician. Is it relational? Is it something that in your relationship that contributes to the issue, which you can kind of address it with your sex therapist, with your psychologist, or you can do like, again, if it's something that you never address, you can do workshops, things of that nature. And the other piece is personal, it's your relationship with your sexuality. So sometimes people, speaking of religion, have tons of religious shame when it comes to sex and sexuality. They were taught from the culture, even if they brought up in the atheist families, that sex is bad, masturbation is bad. So they develop this complicated relationship with their bodies. They develop complicated relationship with premarital sex, and that although it might not be present in their mind all the time, but that's the message that underneath impacts their functioning. The other component is not treated mental health challenges. So it's common, and I would imagine you see it a lot, that many of my clients that they have substance use issues, they have other co-occurring issues like an OCD, like an anxiety, like a depression. And all this are not treated issues also can impact one's sexual functioning and sexual health.
Thank you for that. I would say that the individuals that I see in my practice would mostly fall under two categories. And, that could just be because it's pretty taboo to talk about sexual issues in this country, at least. So maybe we could talk a little bit more about, having this undiagnosed or diagnosed anxiety and depression. And so, you have this disorder, you have this mental illness, you're using drugs or alcohol to cope with your mental illness, and it's becoming out of hand. It's getting to be too much. So you find somebody like you or I, and you set up a treatment plan. What happens next? Do you talk about the sexuality piece and the treatment plan? How does this individual, what would you say to this individual to address the sexuality piece? Like what can they expect now that they're sober? They don't have, maybe they've only had sex under the influence. And so this is going to be a game changer for them. Yeah.
Uh-huh. But first of all, I'm glad that there are therapists like yourself, that psychologists that talk about sex, because sometimes these conversations are not something that the therapists initiate and clients feel uncomfortable talking about and bring it up. But sexual health is extremely important for one's mental health, wellness, and overall wellness. So I think it's important to, regardless. I part of my practice also, I work with people who struggle with eating disorders. But even when I do screening for those people, I always ask about people's sexual health because that's an important part of humans' experience. So first of all, like if you're not if you feel like there's as a client, that's an area that you want to explore, make sure you are bringing it up to your therapist and kind of open up this conversation. And my hope is that's a conversation that many therapists are having and initiating with their clients. So I think that's important part of things. The other piece of it is if you never had a good relationship with sex, it's never too late. Some people think great sex life is for those liberated people out there that they grew up in this wonderful hippie families. And if you are in your 30s and 40s and 50s and you didn't have good sexual experiences, it's like you lost your chance. There's always a good time to start working on sexual health. And so first thing that I recommend people is, first of all, get proper sexual education. Many of us, even people who grew up in Western countries, European countries, they never got proper sex education. They don't know about sexual pleasure, and they don't know what works for their body. And I think that's the most important thing. I know many recovery programs, they talk about mindfulness, and mindfulness is a big part of, could be a big part of recovery. The other, like, first step I recommend people to do is kind of explore your body and practice mindfulness around sexual pleasure. At times I tell people that perhaps you can kind of explore, kind of do mindful masturbation, or if that's something it makes you uncomfortable, like explore your body mindfully, like touching different parts of your body and feel how it feels. So first would be kind of improving your relationship with your body and increasing your body awareness. Because that's something that's at times I see that the people who are in early recovery, that's missing, that they learn to numb from their bodies. And substances are great tools for that. But we want you to be able to connect with your bodies because it's a vehicle for you to experience pleasure. So that would be the first step.
Great. Yeah. Yeah. Mindfulness is huge. And I feel like, even if you don't think that meditation is for you, there's a meditation out there for you. I heard recently of rage yoga. Have you heard of this?
No, what is that?
I don't. It was like a little Instagram post, but from what I can glean, it's basically for individuals who want to swear and yell and scream while they're doing their poses. Maybe that would be an introduction for someone that doesn't like meditation. I'm just spitballing here. Yeah.
And there are tons of great, guided meditation for self-stimulation. And those are
Really?
fantastic. So, I mean, like, sometimes it might not be interesting for people to kind of sit and observe their thoughts. But if you kind of incorporate part of mindful touching and self-stimulation, that can be a wonderful start. And who cannot get on board with that?
Yeah. That sounds good. Okay. Well, as we wrap up here, I thought maybe you could give us just a couple of resources, some things that you frequently recommend, or maybe books that you gift for individuals in recovery.
Absolutely. So one thing I recommend people to look into, and they can just even Google it if that's something that they want to kind of focus on, is kind of the mindfulness, like touch exercises you can do with your partner. So it's called Sensate focused touch, and I'm sure that many of the therapists are familiar with it. There are books on that, and it talks about it's a kind of a 5-6 weeks plan that helps people and guide people through kind of doing this non demanding touches, and it escalates. So you're touching the areas that you see with your partner with clothing, and you can experiment with different types of touching, and then the next phase would be kind of touching without the clothing, and then things can help with kind of like there's different steps that help people to connect with their partner and a slower pace. So sensate focus strategies are something that I highly recommend. If there are women that are in the audience that as far as like they're interested to learn more about their body, I really recommend the book Becoming Cliterate by Dr. Mintz, that talks about the orgasm gap and what can women do to help them with kind of reaching orgasm, if it's issues around orgasm, and what they want, how can they get what they want in bed. So I think that's something else.
Yeah, I just want to highlight one thing. Hopefully I didn't cut you off there.
No problem.
Okay. But I feel like, as far as healthy versus unhealthy relationships, individuals that maybe while they were drinking or struggling with substances had a hard time expressing their wants and their needs. And so now that they're sober, this could be a way for them to get in touch with that sexual part of themselves and to improve those relationships.
Absolutely, and that these are the things that most people haven't learned at school, or kind of like as an adult, to ask what they need in the bedroom and having healthy sexual communication. So I think that can be very helpful. And also in my podcast, I do lots of sex education. So I hope that can be another resource for people who are interested to learn more about sexuality.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And tell the listeners what your podcast is called.
So my podcast called Sexology. I interview experts, and I do at times solo episodes, and I talk about recent finding and psychology of sex, and we talk about different topics based on people's requests, such as what kind of asking what you want in bed, what can you do if there's a desire discrepancy. These are the kind of like we cover a range of different topics. So that's another thing that I hope people check out.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm a big fan of your podcast. Thank you for sharing
for saying that.
Yeah. Dr. Molly, are there any other thoughts that you have as we close up our show today?
I want to emphasize that if you are struggling with sex, that's something that's absolutely treatable, and you need to address it. Because sometimes I get people in my office, they feel like I'm defective, there's something wrong with me, I'm not able to have great sex. It's truly my clinical experience and my belief that whoever want to have great sex, whether they have able body or disabled body, if you are reaching out and to get support, there are support there, and there are solutions out there. So don't assume that this is something that's not fixable if you haven't reached out to get professional help.
Yes. Thank you for saying that. You're not alone. So that's a great way to end the show today. So how can people best find you and all of the amazing work that you're doing?
Oh, thank you so much for that. So they can check out my website. It's sexologypodcast.com. They can find my podcast episodes there, or my private practice website. It's oasis2cure.com. I have a private practice in Los Angeles, California, and they can find all my information on the private practice website as well.
Okay, great. And so I will link to all of the resources that were mentioned in this episode in the show notes over at atheistsinrecovery.com. And again, thank you so much for being on. I really appreciate it.
It was lovely to be on your show. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Atheists in Recovery podcast. For more great info and to stay up to date, head over to atheistsinrecovery.com.